When people think about the damage caused by Russia's aggression, Ukraine usually comes to mind first, and for good reason. But Ukraine isn't the only country caught in Moscow's shadow. Russia's reach stretches much farther, pulling strings and poking its nose into other nations' business whenever it sees a chance. And at the center of it all is Vladimir Putin, who seems determined to stir up trouble wherever possible if it means giving himself more power. Recently, though, one of those plots unraveled in a place you might not hear about often: Moldova. Moldova is a small country tucked between Ukraine and Romania. It used to be part of the Soviet Union, and ever since breaking free in the early 1990s, Russia has tried to keep it on a tight leash. One of the most glaring examples of that is Transnistria, a skinny slice of land on Moldova's eastern edge. For decades, it's been controlled by Russian-backed forces. The region acts almost like its own mini-country, complete with a flag, anthem, and even its own money. Yet the rest of the world doesn't officially recognize it as independent. Even so, Transnistria gives Russia a handy foothold inside Moldova. From there, the Kremlin has pumped in money, spread fake news, and run shady operations, all to sway public opinion and keep Moldovans from drifting closer to the West. But despite all that meddling, Russia hasn't had much luck recently. In Moldova's 2021 elections, voters overwhelmingly backed the Pro-European Party of Action and Solidarity, known as PAS, leaving the pro-Russian camp in the dust. Then, in 2024, Putin's preferred presidential candidate, Alexander Stoyanoglu, lost badly to current President Maya Sandu, who won a second term with more than half the vote. Sandu has made it clear where she stands: firmly with Europe and firmly against Russia's bullying. She's spoken out against Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, voiced strong support for Ukrainians fighting back, and pushed hard for anti-corruption reforms at home. Strengthening ties with the European Union has become one of her top priorities. Now, Moldova is heading into yet another high-stakes moment. On September 28th, just days from now, the country will hold a new parliamentary election. And once again, evidence is surfacing that Russia has been trying to twist the outcome in its favor. Only this time, those efforts may have finally been caught in the act. Authorities in Moldova recently revealed that Russia had been running a secret operation designed to tilt the upcoming election. Investigators say the Kremlin funneled money into political campaigns, paid off local groups to organize protests, and flooded social media with fake stories meant to discredit pro-European leaders. The goal? To convince Moldovans that their country would be safer sticking with Russia rather than building stronger ties with the West. But here's where things took a turn. Moldovan security services, working with international partners, exposed the scheme before it could really take root. Large sums of cash traced back to Moscow were seized. Networks of paid activists were identified. Online troll accounts pumping out disinformation were shut down. In other words, Russia's plan to quietly manipulate the vote didn't stay quiet for long. For President Maya Sandu and her pro-European allies, this discovery couldn't have come at a more important time. The parliamentary election will decide whether her party gets enough seats to keep pushing through reforms, or whether pro-Russian politicians regain a foothold in government. With so much at stake, the Kremlin's interference campaign shows just how high the stakes really are. And the Moldovan people aren't blind to what's happening. Many have lived through years of corruption, economic struggles, and foreign meddling. Seeing Russia's fingerprints all over yet another attempt to shape their future may only strengthen the resolve of those who want a cleaner, more independent government. Still, the road ahead is far from simple. Moldova is a small country with limited resources, sandwiched between two powerful neighbors: Ukraine, which is still fighting a full-scale war for its survival, and Russia, which refuses to give up influence over its former Soviet territories. For ordinary Moldovans, the question becomes, can their nation finally break free from Moscow's grip and chart a path firmly toward Europe? On Monday, September 22nd, Moldovan officials dropped a bombshell. 74 people had been arrested in connection with a plan to spark violent unrest just days before the parliamentary election. Authorities say this wasn't some random street gang. The suspects had reportedly traveled all the way to Serbia, where they were given specialized training, allegedly by Russian instructors. And this wasn't basic marching or chanting practice. The recruits were taught how to stir up chaos during protests, use crowd control tactics against the police, resist arrest if they were detained, and even handle firearms. In other words, they were being prepared to act like a small paramilitary unit disguised as demonstrators. Each person was allegedly promised around €400 for taking part. Hardly a fortune, but enough to tempt people struggling in Moldova's fragile economy. Investigators from Moldova's Organized Crime Prosecutor's Office and the National Police cracked open the plot. Their findings were startling. Some of the recruits had been tricked into thinking they were heading to Serbia for something as harmless as a religious pilgrimage, only to find themselves swept into a training program run under the eye of Russia's own security services. Alexandru Mustiata, head of Moldova's intelligence agency, said Moscow had been pulling the strings the whole time. Adding another layer to the story is a familiar name in Moldovan politics: Ilan Shor. Shor is a fugitive oligarch who made international headlines back in 2014 when roughly $1 billion mysteriously vanished from Moldovan banks, a scandal often called the theft of the century. Despite being implicated, Shor went on to launch his own pro-Russian political group, the Shor Party, which staged waves of disruptive protests across the country. By June 2023, the Constitutional Court banned the party altogether, citing its role in undermining democracy. Shor himself now lives in Russia, where he has been granted citizenship, but from afar, he's still deeply involved in efforts to destabilize Moldova. Officials claim his network, managed on the ground by a man named Andrei Pavlov, played a major role in recruiting and organizing the 74 suspects. To stay hidden, much of the group's communication reportedly took place on Telegram, a popular encrypted messaging app. But secrecy only went so far. Moldovan investigators carried out over 250 raids across the country, even targeting 4 prisons. What they found looked more like preparation for a military campaign than a political protest. Weapons, ammunition, camouflage uniforms, stacks of passports, and other supplies that could have been used to spark riots and plunge the country into chaos. The investigation also uncovered links to local political organizations and even criminal gangs. Igor Dodon, leader of the pro-Russian Socialist Party, admitted that 4 of his party members were among those arrested. If convicted, the suspects could each face up to 8 years in prison. The arrests came just as major outlets like the BBC and Bloomberg published reports confirming that Russia had been working on a broad strategy to meddle in Moldova's upcoming election. According to those reports, Moscow finalized its plans back in the spring, deploying multiple tactics at once: funding parties sympathetic to Russia, spreading disinformation online, and trying to erode trust in President Maya Sandu. Russia's motivation here is crystal clear. Ever since Moldova applied to join the European Union in March 2022, right after Russia invaded Ukraine, Moscow has been desperate to keep the country from drifting too far west. The EU granted Moldova official candidate status only a few months later, and by December 2023, accession talks were officially opened. Negotiations kicked off in June 2024, with President Sandu publicly setting 2030 as her target for full membership. The EU hasn't committed to a firm date yet, but the process is underway. That timeline terrifies the Kremlin. Right now, Moldova is one of the few countries in Europe that doesn't belong to either the EU or NATO. For Russia, that makes it vulnerable and easier to manipulate. But if Moldova successfully joins the EU, the game changes completely. Russia would lose its grip, and the dream of pulling Moldova back into a Moscow-led orbit, something resembling the old Soviet Union, would effectively be gone. This explains why Putin and his allies are so determined to weaken Sandu, discredit her pro-European policies, and boost parties more loyal to Moscow. For them, Moldova isn't just a small neighbor. It's a front line in the battle over Europe's future direction. Reporters following the story say Russia has been throwing the kitchen sink at Moldova in an effort to tilt the playing field. One method involves recruiting Moldovans who live abroad, including many based inside Russia itself, and then busing or flying them to polling stations across Europe to vote. Another tactic, sending in agents to organize protests that look organic but are really staged, designed to spark anger and create the impression that the current government is failing. Then there's the digital battlefield. Russian operatives have been pumping out wave after wave of false stories online, especially on social media. Fake headlines, doctored videos, wild conspiracy theories, you name it. The aim is to confuse, divide, and chip away at Moldovans' trust in their leaders. And that's not even the end of it. Documents obtained by investigative journalists reveal that Putin's own executive office has gone so far as to draw up plans to use compromat, that's the Russian term for compromising material, like dirt or blackmail evidence, against Moldovan officials. The idea was simple: threaten or bribe key people in power to sway the election from the inside. Bloomberg reporters couldn't confirm whether all of these tactics had been fully launched, but European officials they spoke to said it was almost certain Moscow had already set them in motion. Thankfully, Moldovan authorities haven't been sitting back. Police and investigators have been aggressively shutting down these efforts. Just this past August, for instance, they submitted official requests to block more than 440 TikTok accounts accused of spreading fake news and Kremlin-friendly propaganda. Back in Moscow, of course, the Kremlin denies everything. Russian officials stick to the same script they've used for years. We don't meddle in foreign elections. In 2024, around the time of Moldova's presidential race, a Russian foreign ministry spokeswoman even called accusations of interference Russophobia, dismissing the claims as part of what she labeled a European Moldova project. But President Maya Sandu has no illusions about what's going on. Earlier this month, while addressing European lawmakers in Strasbourg, she didn't mince her words. The Kremlin's goal is clear, she said. They want to capture Moldova through the ballot box, use us against Ukraine, and turn us into a launchpad for hybrid attacks on the European Union. That's why this election is very important. By defending it, we protect not only Moldova, but also regional security and stability. Moldova may be the testing ground, but Europe is the target. This isn't paranoia. Moldova has seen Moscow's fingerprints all over its politics for years. Time after time, local investigators uncover elaborate plots that, when unraveled, always seem to lead back to Russia. Take October 2024, for example. Police revealed an almost unbelievable vote-buying scheme linked yet again to fugitive oligarch Ilan Shor. Authorities said $39 million had been funneled into Moldova through PSB, a Russian state-owned banking service. In just a few weeks, about 1 million separate transfers were made directly into Moldovan citizens' accounts. The timing wasn't accidental. This was right before both the presidential election and Moldova's EU referendum, which were held on the very same day. The goal couldn't have been clearer: buy loyalty, buy votes, and buy Moldova's future. By the end of 2024, the numbers were staggering. Around 500 Moldovans were fined for passive electoral corruption, essentially for taking money in exchange for votes. President Maya Sandu later revealed that criminal groups had tried to buy as many as 300,000 votes in total. Authorities could confirm that at least 138,000 citizens had actually received funds, but the real figure may have been much higher. Soon after, Moldova's intelligence service, SIS, dropped another bombshell report that peeled back the curtain on just how deep Russia's interference ran during the presidential election and EU referendum. The details were shocking, but in some ways not all that surprising. After all, the Kremlin has a long history of meddling through bribery, deception, and manipulation. Investigators discovered that earlier in 2024, Russia had set up a fully fledged command center in Moscow to oversee operations in Moldova. This wasn't a rogue group of hackers. It was directed by the FSB, Russia's main intelligence agency and the direct descendant of the old Soviet KGB. The mission was clear: sabotage Moldova's elections by any means necessary.
If you've made it this far into the video, it means you're enjoying what we do here at Euro Bulletin. Take a second to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more updates and insights from Europe and its partners. Let's dive in more into the subject.
At the top of the pyramid sat Moscow, pulling the strings on finances and political strategy. Below that, Moldovan branches handled everything from PR campaigns and legal maneuvering to outreach with young people. The report mapped out 119 territorial cells spread across the country, each feeding into a massive structure of 1,900 smaller groups and nearly 33,000 paid activists. Those activists, many earning the equivalent of $180 a month, helped mobilize an even larger base of around 80,000 sympathizers. Together, they formed a sprawling shadow network dedicated to amplifying Kremlin narratives inside Moldova. Two organizations were at the heart of this machine: the so-called Eurasia Group and the Victory Bloc of political parties. Eurasia, launched in Moscow in April 2024, presented itself as a cultural non-profit, but really acted as a funnel for Russian influence, recruiting young Moldovans by offering sponsored trips to Russia. The Victory Bloc, meanwhile, was built out of Ilan Shore's political allies and operated under the influence of Russia's ruling party, United Russia. Funding all this required creativity. The Kremlin relied on an elaborate web of financial tricks, flying in suitcases of cash, routing money through sanctioned Russian banks via intermediaries in Central Asia, and even using cryptocurrency and prepaid Russian bank cards. Fake donations were also engineered to make the money look like it came from ordinary citizens. On the propaganda front, the scale was equally breathtaking. Hundreds of TikTok accounts, Telegram channels, Facebook groups, and bots on Russia's own V-Contact social network were mobilized to flood Moldovan feeds with anti-EU and pro-Russian messaging. They created fake government websites, bought tens of thousands of euros worth of ads, and hammered voters with an endless stream of disinformation. Religion, too, was weaponized. Investigators found evidence that Russia had flown about 500 Moldovan Orthodox priests to Moscow. Once there, they were reportedly offered Russian-issued payment cards and promised big financial rewards if they returned home and used their pulpits to push anti-European rhetoric. For a deeply religious society like Moldova, this was a targeted attempt to sway hearts and minds through trusted voices. But perhaps the most troubling part of the entire report had nothing to do with priests, propaganda, or money laundering. What really alarmed investigators was Moscow's long-term strategy for Moldova's youth, the next generation of voters, leaders, and citizens. Investigators say one of the most alarming parts of Russia's playbook has been its focus on young Moldovans. Organizers allegedly set up secret camps and training programs not only in Moscow but also in Bosnia and Herzegovina. There, young recruits were drilled in how to stage protests, handle confrontations with law enforcement, and manipulate crowds. Some went even further, receiving military-style instruction in drone operations and improvised devices. The effects of that training didn't stay theoretical. Authorities later discovered that several of these youths were directly involved in vandalizing government buildings back home in Moldova. It was proof that Russia's influence programs weren't just abstract, they were spilling out onto Moldovan streets. This youth-focused effort was only one layer in what officials describe as a long-running, highly coordinated Kremlin strategy. Even as Moldovan police rack up arrests and expose plots, nobody in Chisinau believes Russia will stop trying. Instead, the country has had to adapt, treating Moscow's interference as a constant fact of life. President Maya Sandu, more than anyone else, has shouldered the responsibility of confronting it head-on. She's been raising alarms for months. Back in April, Sandu warned that Russia was plotting to seize Moldova's political leadership through heavy-handed meddling in the upcoming elections. "We saw unprecedented interference last year," she said in a televised interview, "and it is absolutely clear that this year Russia will again try to influence the outcome." Sandu also stressed what a Kremlin-controlled Moldova would mean for the war next door. With a 760-mile border shared with Ukraine, Moldova could become a dangerous launchpad for Russia, opening up a new Western front against Kyiv. That, she warned, could change the course of the war almost overnight. At the same time, Moldova itself would risk being dragged directly into the conflict. "Today we serve as a kind of shield for Ukraine," Sandu noted. "But if Russia gets its way, Moldova could transform from a protective force into a threat." Her warnings haven't let up. On September 22nd, Sandu accused Moscow of pouring hundreds of millions of euros into schemes designed to buy votes, bribe activists, and saturate Moldovan society with lies. "People are intoxicated daily with falsehoods," she said. "Hundreds of individuals are paid to provoke disorder, violence, and spread fear. If Russia gains control over Moldova, the consequences will be immediate and dangerous for our country and for the entire region. Every Moldovan will suffer, no matter who they voted for." Journalists, analysts, and European officials back her up. Kaja Kallas, vice president of the European Commission, warned that Moldova faces hybrid threats ahead of its elections. Russia is likely to use cash, content, and coercion to meddle. She added bluntly, "Only the people of Moldova should decide their future, free from interference." European leaders are rallying too. In August, French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk all traveled to Moldova's capital, Chisinau, in a show of solidarity. But even with that support, the outcome of the upcoming election remains uncertain. What is clear is that Russia's campaign of interference won't end here. For the Kremlin, Moldova is just one of many battlegrounds in its wider push to destabilize European democracies. This narrow strip of land hugs Moldova's eastern border along the Dniester River, directly adjacent to Ukraine. On a map, it might look small, just about 1,600 square miles, roughly 12% of Moldova's territory, but its significance is huge. Since the early 1990s, after a brief but bloody conflict, Russian-backed forces have maintained control there. To this day, Transnistria operates almost like a parallel country, with its own flag, anthem, parliament, and even a currency. Yet the world does not officially recognize it as independent. For Moscow, Transnistria is a geopolitical goldmine. It gives Russia a military foothold right inside Moldova and places troops alarmingly close to western Ukraine. Estimates vary, but around 1,500 Russian soldiers are stationed in the region, supposedly as peacekeepers. They're backed by local armed units and heavily stocked Soviet-era weapons depots. For Moldovans and Ukrainians alike, that presence is like a loaded gun sitting on the table. Maybe it won't go off, but the threat is always there. During Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, fears spiked that the Kremlin might try to link up